I'm really excited about sharing this with all of you because this is why we are here. This is how we started the Citizens for Peace. Almost 13 years ago to the month, it will be 13 years, November 11th was our first meeting. And we came together because we had gone to a conference, Organizing Michigan, to call for a Department of Peace. I was at Unity in April for, it was Earth Day, and they had a little petition that said, you know, sign if you believe a Department of Peace is a good idea. And I signed it and didn't think anything of it. And then I retired, and in September I got an invitation to this meeting to lobby for a Department of Peace, and I thought, of course we need a Department of Peace. We have a Department of War that was changed into the name Department of Defense, but we need a Department of Peace because that's what we all want. So I said to George, let's go, and we went, and when we broke up into groups, I introduced myself, and I said, well, I just retired from 35 years of teaching in Detroit, and they said, well, you can be our leader. And I thought, well, I didn't know what I was going to do with my retirement, and now I do. I'm going to devote my life to peace. What better thing to do? And so that's why we're here. And we've just been rocking in those 13 years, and it started with the idea, with the vision. So, the vision of a peaceful future. Last week I got this email, and here it was, our very own Rosa Parks. And here's her quote. I thought this was perfect to start this presentation. Without vision, the people will perish. And without courage and inspiration, dreams will die. The dream of freedom and peace. Another very wise, wise woman of peace. And that is what the Department of Peace idea is. It is a vision. One dream can change everything. It's inspirational. And that's why we need a Department of Peace. And we're going to talk more about why we need this, but I love that quote. We need the Department of Peace because every other approach to peace has failed. Obviously, we do not have peace. So let's try something that would work. And there has never been an organized, research-based approach to creating a peaceful country and world. A Department of Peace would fill that gap. That is what is needed. And it's been needed for quite a while. We're going to go into a real brief history of the Department of Peace. The idea, that dream, that vision of peace started way back in 1783 with George Washington calling for a proper peace establishment. 1792, it was published in Benjamin Banneker's Almanac. Dr. Benjamin Rush and Benjamin Banneker called for an Office of Peace with peace education in all schools. But it took all the way till 1925, and Carrie Chapman Catt of the National League of Women Voters at the Cause and Cure for War Conference publicly suggested a cabinet-level Department of Peace and Secretary of Peace be established. So this idea goes back to 1925, and then the next year, Kirby Page, the author of the National Peace Department, wrote and published and distributed the first proposal for a cabinet-level Department of Peace and Secretary of Peace. But it took, again, another 10 years. Sometimes things move slowly, like this idea, but it's still an awesome idea. Dr. Frederick Kettner published an essay, The Need for a Secretary of Peace. The reason we need a Secretary of Peace, a cabinet-level position, is anything else wouldn't be that effective. When you're in the Oval Office or the War Room or whatever it's called, you need someone that is going to give you the best advice, and you need someone right there You don't just need all the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Secretary of State. You need someone that's going to tell you the research, how we can prevent violence, how we can avoid war and save us lives and money. So here it was, way back then, the need for a Secretary of Peace. The next part, I got this from Anthony Adolph's Peace, A World History, and he made a little error in the next one, and I didn't have time to check it because my computers were crashing, I was moving. It's been very hectic the last few weeks, so I managed to get this together, but I'm going to share some accurate ideas. In fact, you could probably go to the next page because that isn't right. In 4388 bills were not introduced in 1943. However, in 1935, a senator of West Virginia, Senator Neely, introduced the first bill calling for the creation of a U.S. Department of Peace. And it was reintroduced in 37 and 39, not 85 times. But in 43, Senator Wiley, a Republican from Wisconsin, spoke on the Senate floor calling for the U.S. to be the first government in the world to have a Secretary of Peace. So from the start, it's been bipartisan, this idea. Then in 45, Representative Lewis Ludlow of Indiana called for the creation of a U.S. Department of Peace. In 46, Jennings Randolph, a senator, called for a U.S. Department of Peace. In 47, the Republican Everett Dirksen from Illinois introduced the bill calling for a peace division in the State Department. And now, from 55 to 68, 85 Senate and House representative bills were introduced calling for a Department of Peace. That's a lot of energy in our government calling for this idea to come forward. And we're so honored to have Caroline Trout here, whose father, Dr. Lustig, who is a doctor, a scientist, and he went to Germany right after the war on an assignment. He wore an army uniform, and he went to observe the healthcare system in Germany. And can you imagine going to Germany after the destruction of World War II in Germany? He was overwhelmed by it. I won't go into the details. Caroline sent me a little note about it, but you could just imagine how extreme that was. He decided when he came back he was going to devote his life to peace and working for peace. And he and a friend, Wilfred Peterson, who's very well known, he's with the science...
author.
He's an author, and what was that? The Science of the Mind magazine. He wrote for that and everything. So he's very well known and often quoted. So with Wilfred Peterson, Dr. Lustig, that's Caroline's father, lobbied for a Department of Peace, along with so many other doctors and, you know, intelligentsia in this country, people that knew war was not the answer. And I'm going to just share this quote from Wilfred Peterson. I love this so much. You may have heard of it. Walk with the dreamers, the believers, the courageous, the cheerful, the planners, the doers, the successful people with their head in the clouds and their feet on the ground. Let their spirit ignite a fire within you to leave this world better than when you found it. And that's who we are. We are the dreamers. We are the believers. We believe in peace. We dream about peace. We talk peace. We think peace. We act peacefully. We have our head in the clouds because we know that idea of a Department of Peace is what we need to bring right into reality. And we're not going to give up because we know it is the dream that we need to be part of the fulfillment of. So I just absolutely love that. The soul, I'm going to continue with the history. I forgot, yeah. So Senator Vance Hartke of Illinois and Senator Halpern of New York in '69 called for the Department of Peace. And then here comes our hero, Dennis Kucinich. He was the peacemaker. And in 2001, in August, he introduced his bill calling for the Department of Peace 1 month before 9/11. Now, can you imagine if we had been wise enough to listen to all these other people, Caroline's father, 80-some bills, the George Washington, Benjamin Banneker, all of these people saying the same thing. This is what we need in this government. We need to have our government focused on how can we have a more peaceful world and a more peaceful country. So we're really proud of Dennis Kucinich. However, he was gerrymandered out of his job, and then in 2010, I don't know if you know this, but Change.org asked the country to come up with their very best ideas to give to President Obama. And so all these ideas went out over the internet. And the Department of Peace idea got the second most votes in the whole country. We came in second. And that means thousands of people were online voting for this idea. In 2010, 6 years ago, there was a lot of energy. We had so much hope for peace. I mean, Obama won the Nobel Peace Prize. And yet, here we still are saying we still need a Department of Peace. And does anyone know what the #1 idea was? What? Okay, kind of health care. Legalizing marijuana. That was the #1 idea. And guess what? It is happening. So maybe now after marijuana is getting to be more reasonable, maybe the #2 idea, which is so much more important, will be the idea that we will have come into fruition finally, because we need it so desperately. But then in 2013, with Dennis Kucinich not there, thank goodness for Representative Barbara Lee of California. She took over. She picked up the torch for peace, and she introduced the Department of Peacebuilding, because she was encouraging more peace building, not just a Department of Peace, but peace building, and she reintroduced that in 2015. So Barbara Lee was the only person in 2001 not to authorize the money, the unlimited power of the president to go to war and spend all of our money. So Barbara Lee is a champion. I have thanked her, and I encourage you to thank her too. She's just awesome. So that was a little bit of the history, and as you can see, this idea is strong, and it's not going away, because there are people like us that are committed to bringing that vision forward. So what will a Department of Peacebuilding work to do? It will provide much assistance to the cities, the counties, the state government in coordinating existing programs, as well as developing new programs based on the best practices. We have brilliant things going on in Philadelphia and in California, and why don't we have a way to share the best practices to eliminate violence, or at least decrease violence? It would also teach violence prevention and mediation to school children. Our Kevin Zawala, Mr. Peace, has devoted his life to helping young people realize there are better ways. You will be happier if you don't bully. You will feel more fulfilled if you're generous and kind and compassionate. So we need that in the schools. And that idea went back to the beginning, the founding of our country, having the peace taught in the schools. And it will dismantle gang psychology. So many of the problems in these cities are gangs fighting with each other. In fact, in Sally's book, another hero of mine that I met twice at the Department of Peace conference, 2 different times, Azim Kamisa, and I've mentioned him before. He is probably the most saintly person I've ever met. He's a Sufi Muslim, And when his only son was shot and killed delivering a pizza, it just really, you could imagine, his only son, who was a college student, and a young gang member was told, bust the bones, and he shot him and killed him. And Azim Khamisa knew there were victims at both ends of the gun. And he also realized that he knew the conditions that these kids were being raised in LA, I guess South Central LA, or, someplace there, and he did nothing. And he accepted responsibility to do something. And because his only son was killed, Tariq, he reached out to the killer's, 14-year-old killer's guardian, and that was his grandfather, and he asked him to join him and help young people not accept the conditions and not join gangs, and to work against youth violence. They've gone to schools, the program's just mushroomed, and just like Sally, she took that pain and turned it into the effort to eliminate the death penalty. Azim Khamisa, amazing man. And these are the kinds of programs that the Youth Promise Act would fund, proven successful. I mean, in California, you spend $130,000 to incarcerate a male juvenile. And the program to stop it, and with a 90% success rate, is $8,000. So this makes so much sense. Dollars and cents, sense for the mind. I mean, that's teaching violence prevention and eliminating gang psychology and rehabilitating the prison population. This is an idea that is really coming to fruition, because both Republicans and Democrats realize that we have more incarcerated than almost any other country except China with their billions. We have so many prisoners because of the craziness of our laws. So this has got to change, and we've got to have rehabilitation of prisoners. 90% of them get out of prison. And what are they getting out to? So we need that. Building peacemaking efforts among cultures too. So, yes, the international violence will be one part of the peace building. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates has said that the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have taught us that military might is insufficient to win, that we must expand our capacity to build civil society structures, rule of law, jobs, responsible and accountable government, the police and fire, education. If you want peace, you have to have a society that has these structures. And what better structure than in the government to have a place that would effectively show ways to decrease violence, and that's what a Department of Peace would do, even internationally, if the other governments would have that. And Gates also said that we're still fighting the Cold War. The Cold War is done, and we're still thinking of spending millions of dollars updating our nuclear weapons. What insanity is this? I can't even comprehend that someone that is running for president wouldn't say, we have to stop it. I mean, it's one thing we have this Iran deal, which is wonderful, and yet they're saying, oh, it's horrible. They're getting their money back, and we shouldn't be giving them money. And, here we are working with Iran. It's much better to work with an enemy and make them a friend. And it's a 9/11 world. You cannot bomb all the terrorists without bombing all these civilians. We see the disaster in Iraq. So international violence obviously would be addressed with the Department of Peace. But the violence in the United States, the Department of Peace building, 85% of the budget would be used right here in this country to help with the violence in our country. We have these school shootings, little kids being killed. In all the time since 9/11, there have been 70 killings of Americans by terrorists. There have been I forget whether the number was like 300,000 killed in this country because of our own guns. Leonard Pitt just had an article in the Free Press about that. In fact, I meant to have it quoted exactly. But it's insane, and yet we're so afraid of the terrorists. We have more likelihood to be shot by someone in our country, and women have more likelihood to be shot by someone they know because of the domestic violence. If there's a gun in the house, it doesn't provide safety. It ends up not a good scene. So that's just off the track, but definitely when you're spending $300 billion, probably more now, the World Health Organization says, because of our violence in this country. So we have to apply skills, new skills, and practices to deal with the violence to save money and lives. So the majority would be spent on that, decreasing violence in this country. And that's what the Citizens for Peace is all about. That is our motto, you know, promoting the practices and principles of nonviolence, because it is the key. And the latest research on the success of nonviolence is with Erica Chenoweth, a doctor. And I'm going to share her TED Talk. And okay, I'm going to sit down and watch this with you.
I'd like you to imagine that you live in a really repressive country. There are elections, but they're fake. The leader wins 100% of the vote each time. Security forces beat up opposition leaders with impunity, and they harass everyone else. This is a country where being in this room right now would get you on a list. Now let's say you've had enough, and so have many other people that you talk with in low whispers. Now I'm not talking about the Hunger Games, although that would be awesome. Unfortunately, I'm talking about real-world conditions that many people face right now. So assuming you've decided to act, what would be the best way for you to challenge the system and create something new? My own answer to this question has changed over the past few years. In 2006, I was a PhD student here at CU Boulder studying political science, and my dissertation was on how and why people use violence to create political change in their countries. As for the scenario I just described, well, back then I bought into the idea that power flows from the barrel of a gun. And what I would have said was that although it was tragic, it was logical in such situations for people to use violence to seek their change. But then I was invited to an academic workshop put on by the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. They were giving a week-long primer on nonviolent resistance to try to get people like me to teach about it in our classes. Now, my view of all of this at the time was that it was well-intentioned but dangerously naive. I mean, the readings they sent me in advance argued that the best way for people to seek really difficult political changes was through nonviolent or civil resistance. They described civil resistance as an active form of conflict where unarmed civilians would use tactics like protests, boycotts, demonstrations, and lots of other forms of mass non-cooperation to seek change. They brought up cases like Serbia, where a nonviolent revolution toppled Slobodan Milosevic, the butcher of the Balkans, in October of 2000, and the Philippines, where the People Power movement ousted Ferdinand Marcos in 1986. At the workshop, I said stuff like, well, those were probably exceptions. For every successful case you guys bring up, I can think of a failed case like Tiananmen Square. I can also think of plenty of cases where violence worked pretty well, like the Russian, French, and Algerian revolutions. Maybe nonviolent resistance works if you're seeking environmental reforms, gender rights, labor rights, but it can't work generally if you're trying to overthrow a dictator or become a new country. And it definitely can't work if the authoritarian leader you're facing is not incompetent, as somebody who's really brutal and ruthless. So by the end of the week, as you can imagine, I wasn't very popular. But my soon-to-be co-author, Maria Steffen, came up to me and said something like, if you're right, why don't you prove it? Are you curious enough to study this in a serious way empirically? Now, believe it or not, nobody had really done that before systematically. And although I was still skeptical, I was curious. I figured that if they were right and I was wrong, somebody better find out. So for the next 2 years, I collected data on all major nonviolent and violent campaigns for the overthrow of the government or territorial liberation since 1900. The data covered the entire world, and consist of every known case where there were at least 1,000 observed participants. This is hundreds of cases. Then I analyzed the data, and the results blew me away. From 1900 to 2006, nonviolent campaigns worldwide were twice as likely to succeed outright as violent insurgencies. And there's more. This trend has been increasing over time, so that in the last 50 years, nonviolent campaigns are becoming increasingly successful and common, whereas violent insurgencies are becoming increasingly rare and unsuccessful. This is true even in those extremely brutal authoritarian conditions where I expected nonviolent resistance to fail. So why is civil resistance so much more effective than armed struggle? The answer seems to lie in people power itself. Researchers used to say that no government could survive if just 5% of its population rose up against it. Our data show that the number may be lower than that. No single campaigns failed during that time period after they'd achieved the active and sustained participation of just 3.5% of the population. And lots of them succeeded with far fewer than that. Now, 3.5% is nothing to sneeze at. In the US today, that's like 11 million people. But get this, every single campaign that surpassed that 3.5% was a nonviolent one. In fact, the nonviolent campaigns were on average 4 times larger than the average violent campaigns. And they were often much more inclusive and representative in terms of gender, age, race, political party, class, and the urban-rural distinction. Civil resistance allows people of all different levels of physical ability to participate. So this can include the elderly, people with disabilities, women, children, and anyone else who wants to. If you think about it, everyone is born with a natural physical ability to resist nonviolently. Anyone here who has kids knows how hard it is to pick up a child who doesn't want to move, or to feed a child who doesn't want to eat. Violent resistance, on the other hand, is a little more physically demanding, and that makes it a little bit more exclusive. In my case, when I was in college, I was in military science classes because I planned to go through the ROTC program and become an Army officer. Now, I really liked the rappelling, the shooting at the range, the map reading, of course, and the uniforms. But I wasn't stoked when they asked me to get up in the wee hours of the morning and run until I vomited. So I quit and chose the far less demanding career of professor. Not everybody wants to take the same chances in life, and many people won't turn up unless they expect safety in numbers. The visibility of many civil resistance tactics like protests allow them to draw these risk-averse people into the fray. Put yourself back in that repressive country for just a minute. Let's say your trusted friend and neighbor comes to you and says, I know you sympathize with our cause. We're going to have a mass demonstration down the street tonight at 8 o'clock. I hope to see you there. Now, I don't know about you all, but I am not the person who's going to show up at 7:55 and see what's up. I'm probably going to look outside my window at 8:30 and see what's going on. If I see 6 people congregated there in the square, I'm going to sit this one out. But if I see 6,000 and more coming down the alleyway, I just might join in. My point here is that the visibility of civil resistance actions allows them to attract more active and diverse participation from these ambivalent people. And once they become involved, it's almost guaranteed that the movement will then have links to security forces, civilian bureaucrats, economic and business elites, educational elites, state media, religious authorities, and the like, and those people start to reevaluate their own allegiances. No regime loyalists in any country live entirely isolated from the population itself. They have friends, they have family members, they have existing relationships that they have to live with in the long term, whether or not the leader stays or goes. In Serbia, when it became obvious that hundreds of thousands of Serbs were descending on Belgrade to demand that Milosevic leave office, police officers started to disobey the order to shoot on demonstrators. When one of them was asked why he did so, he said simply, I knew my kids would be in the crowd. Some of you are thinking, is this person insane? I watch the news and I see protesters getting shot at all the time. And it's true. Sometimes crackdowns do happen. But even in those cases, the nonviolent campaigns were outperforming the violent ones by 2 to 1. It turns out that when security forces beat up, arrest, or even shoot unarmed activists, there is indeed safety in numbers. Large, well-coordinated campaigns can shift between tactics that are concentrated, like protests or demonstrations, to tactics of dispersion, where people stay away from places they were expected to go. They do strikes, they bang on pots and pans, they stay at home, they shut off their electricity at a coordinated time of day. These tactics are much less risky. They're very hard, or at least very costly to suppress, but the movement stays just as disruptive. What happens in these countries once the dust settles? Well, it turns out that the way you resist matters in the long run, too. Most strikingly, countries in which people wage nonviolent struggle were way more likely to emerge with democratic institutions than countries in which they wage violent struggle. And those countries with nonviolent campaigns were 15% less likely to relapse into civil war. The data are clear. When people rely on civil resistance, their size grows. And when large numbers of people remove their cooperation from an oppressive system, the odds are ever in their favor. So, I and many others like me had ignored the millions of people worldwide who were skillfully using civil resistance in favor of studying just things that blow up. I was left with a few questions about the way I used to think. Why was it so easy and comfortable for me to think that violence works? And why did I find it acceptable to assume that violence happens almost automatically because of circumstances or by necessity, that it's the only way out of some situations? In a society that celebrates battlefield heroes on national holidays, I guess it was natural to grow up believing that violence and courage are one and the same, and that true victories cannot come without bloodshed on both sides. But the evidence I presented here today suggests that for people serious about seeking change, there are realistic alternatives. Imagine what our world would look like now if we allowed ourselves to develop some faith in them. What if our history courses emphasized the decade of mass civil disobedience that came before the Declaration of Independence, rather than the war that came after? What if our social studies textbooks emphasized Gandhi and King in the first chapter, rather than as an afterthought? And what if every child left elementary school knowing more about the suffragist movement than they did about the Battle of Bunker Hill? What if it became common knowledge that when protest becomes too dangerous, there are many nonviolent techniques of dispersion that might keep movements safe and active? Okay, so here we are, 2013 in Boulder, Colorado. Maybe some of you are thinking, that's great that civil resistance works, and what can I do? Encourage your children to learn more about the nonviolent legacies of the past 200 years and explore the potential of people power. Tell your elected representatives to stop perpetuating the misguided view that violence pays by supporting the first groups in a civil uprising who take up arms. Although civil resistance cannot be exported or imported, it's time for our officials to embrace a different way of thinking. That in both the short and longer term, civil resistance tends to leave behind societies in which people can live more freely and more peaceably together. Now that we know what we know about the power of nonviolent conflict, I see it as our shared responsibility to spread the word so that future generations don't fall for the myth that violence is their only way out. Thank you.
While we're connected to the internet, Kevin, maybe we could just skip to the last slide and play the Peace Alliance one.
Sure.
And I'm going to take a pause here and ask for reactions to Erica Chenoweth's research. Yes, George, I was going to call on you anyway because he's got something to show us.
I went to a global conference on nonviolence down Cobo Hall a number of years ago.
Yeah, we were in it.
Yeah, and where am I going with this? There's a couple different things. I sat next to a Sergeant Brown who handles most violent crimes in Detroit. And There's a lot of dialogue during a certain afternoon workshop, and then the next day, I'm there early, and he's there early, we're having coffee and talking, and he said, I was really struck by what you said yesterday, and I said, what? He said, we've got to get to prevention. And he quoted a statement about we have to get to where men train young boys to become men without going by way of warrior. And that's a big project, but that's preventative.
Yeah, wonderful. And one of the biggest successes of a nonviolent protest was the civil rights movement, and our hero, Martin Luther King, who followed Gandhi. And George is going to share something. Do you want to come up, or do you want me to come down there? Or, yeah, he has something to show us, because he was very involved.
In 1965, I was a student at Berea College in Kentucky, and Selma, the Bloody Sunday happened on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And 4 other fellows at Berea and I had lunch the next day. We had heard National Council of Churches and Martin Luther King were calling for help because they were going to march again. And we looked at each other. We didn't even hash it around. We said, let's go. And we only had a VW Beetle, and 5 of us squeezed into it. I went by, I stopped at my mother's on the way out of town, not to ask permission, but to tell her I'm going, and she gave me her blessing. We went down there and drove through the night and took training at Brown Chapel. And I'll never forget the folks with bandages and blood saying, bless you for coming so far to be here, but if you want to rethink this and you're realizing how serious it is, it's okay if you go back home right now. So we decided to stay. We took the training. Dr. King came in. In Brown Chapel, we were singing all the peace, civil rights songs. I thought that building was going to rock down. The spirit and the strength there were incredible. We marched out onto the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and that was what was become known as Turnaround Tuesday, because he decided we're not going to go through. This could be a trap, and we're going to get federal help soon. We came back, and went back to Berea and organized 58 students, ministers, and faculty. We took a Greyhound bus and 5 cars down to Montgomery to join the march coming in. Well, skip 50 years later, the college invited me down last year for the 50th Jubilee. They took a whole beautiful Berea bus group down to Berea, including the president of Berea College. Now get this, 50 years prior, we couldn't get the college bus, we couldn't get cooperation, I couldn't get the student senate to do anything. But now, 50 years later, we've got the college president, the current one, and the dean going with us, and 24 students. And we had about 14 alumni back that had been amongst the 58 marchers. So simultaneous to that, Congress, can you believe it, unanimously passed a resolution granting gold medal honor status on all the folks that marched in some of Montgomery marches. There were 3 of them. And I never dreamt that I would be involved in something that, you know, had that. So there's only 1 gold medal, and it's in the museum in Selma. But my sisters just gave me a U.S. Mint bronze rendition of it, and it's quite amazing. It weighs as heavy as a Olympic gold medal. Yeah, it's heavy.
And it says, "Foot soldiers for justice." And I think George deserves a hand. Congratulations. Selma to Montgomery marches, 1965. This is the power of nonviolence right here. Yeah, I have chills, don't you? Congratulations.
I got one footnote. When we reunited there and told our stories on campus before we went down for the 50th, I said, you know, it just dawned on me on the way down here to do this. Back in '65, when the 5 of us left to go to Selma, we didn't pack a toothbrush, an extra pair of shoes, or anything. We just went. And had we been successful on the bridge to keep going, we weren't prepared logistically for it, but we went.
Wow, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Well, we're going to go right to the other video that I embedded that didn't work, but we got the internet thanks to our tech guy, Kevin. So, is it ready to? This is a very short one. about the Peace Alliance, our sister organization, our national organization.
Unmuted.
Too loud.
Look at us. We're flying further, connecting faster, and building higher. We're accessing masses of knowledge with ease, curing disease with accelerating pace. We're harnessing mountain, sea, shore, and air. When it comes to peace, where do we stand? Peacebuilding is our next frontier. Peacebuilding means providing tools parents need to nurture their children who are wound and dead with nonviolence. Teaching our kids in the classroom exactly how to resolve conflict and hopefully well-being. Bringing an end to gun violence through hands-on community intervention. Redirecting criminal justice for restorative practices and focus on repairing what done rather than merely punishing offenders. Inventing alternative processes through emergency action shown to mediate and resolve conflict. This good work is happening now, and much more needs to be done. And to see this through, we need you. Yes, you. We're the Peace Alliance, and with your support, we will build peace everywhere. Look at us. Grassroots education and advocacy work. Making transform communities, communities and kids, restoring conflict-free treatments. Responding in ways, accuracy, enacting effective peace policies, education, equitable benefits, peace, globalization, and commitment to joint and make a difference. Now look at us. We're flying further. We're connecting faster. And most importantly, we're building peace. See how you can help at peacealliance.org.
I'm sorry you couldn't really hear what they were saying, but this 2-minute video is on the Peace Alliance website, right on the front page. And it goes over the 5 segments that the Peace Alliance is now divided into, and how we can be the movement, and we're part of this. I think I'm just going to stop and encourage you to go to the website. I was going to do the rest of my PowerPoint, but basically you can see this on the website. This is what we have been doing, empowering community peace building. We've been advocating for teaching peace in schools, humanizing the justice system, restorative practices in the schools and restorative justice in the court system. And it is getting big, and it's happening. And we started with cultivating personal peace. We knew you couldn't be an angry peace protester and expect you're going to create peace, because it comes from within. The peace within, you've got to connect with that first. And that's why when we started the Citizens for Peace, we decided inner peace, education, educating ourselves and others, and influencing the whole community and world to have a culture of peace, to create the beloved community that Dr. Martin Luther King said that's what we have to do. And we've done all kinds of activities, and the Peace Alliance is carrying on. I'm going to share a quote from Martin Luther King that I think really expresses where we need to go with our thinking, like they were saying in the prior video. Erica Chenoweth, she admitted when she did that research, she changed her thinking. Because the research showed the success of nonviolence. And if people knew, they would, how can you say you're going to be violent? I remember Carl Levin, when, we were talking to him, and he said, there's no military solution to this. There's no military solution to so many of these problems. And we know that. We've known it for 13 years. But here's Martin Luther King, one of our heroes. This is what he said about violence, and this is why we're working so hard to do prevention and the practices and principles of nonviolence. The ultimate weakness of violence is that it is a descending spiral begetting the very thing it seeks to destroy. Instead of diminishing evil, it multiplies it. Through violence, you may murder the liar, but you cannot murder the lie, nor establish the truth. Through violence, you murder the hater, but you do not murder hate. In fact, violence merely increases hate. Returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding, this is my favorite part, deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. And that is what active nonviolence is. That is what the Citizens for Peace have been about for 13 years, focusing on love and peace. And that's how we create the more peaceful future. And that's why we still need the vision of a Department of Peace. And we can all be the movement. We can join the Peace Alliance, go to the website, see the little video. There's so much information there to share. But I'm going to stop my presentation, and we have got so much to talk about as Citizens for Peace. So thank you for listening, and we're going to have our business meeting in a minute. Thank you so much.